most all of society is under some kind of groupthink spell.
Yes.
And, we'd all like to think, oh, I'm not. I don't succumb to that. But it's shocking how well engineered it has been. So take it away, Tiffany.
There's actually something called the revelation of the method, which uses a doctrine of kind of what's hidden in plain sight. And this is a way that, the powers that really are seeking to have power and control over humanity are using our free will essentially against us. So what's the truth about Hermetic laws and the revelation of the method is you have to get buy-in. So a really good way to get buy-in from a person is to induce fear. And when you induce a fear, and then you give somebody a solution within that fear, even though it may not be the solution that you would do from a sovereign self, it is essentially you choosing by your own free will to go in whatever direction you might be choosing. One could be into the hands of the totalitarian control, and one could be, no, I'm going to take the freedom route. So this has to do with what it is that we consent to.
Well, two things. First of all, totalitarian control sounds like a very harsh word, like we're looking at, Italy, World War II or whatnot, but it actually has very, very fine, nuanced tentacles and has reached into societies right now today, including the United States, and deep into us individually, and we don't even... In fact, David, years ago, called it the totalitarian tiptoe.
Yes, exactly.
That you're marching toward it a little bit all the time, and because it's just tiptoeing, you don't even see what's happening to you. And he was right.
It's the frogs being boiled in water.
Exactly.
You're just gently turning up the heat. You don't even notice that that's what's happening.
Exactly, and I'm going to have you talk about that in a moment, about how it's reaching into our lives and the effects of it on our psyche en masse and probably and even individually. But I just want to say, you brought up the word Hermetic earlier, and I've studied Hermetics for years, and many, many people have. And it's interesting because these are simply explaining kind of natural law and how it works. And here you have someone like Manly P. Hall, which produces absolutely beautiful work that you can use with deep conscience and will to have fabulous outcomes with Hermetic principles. Then you have others that, well, maybe arguably Aleister Crowley, for example, who might be using it for more controlling purposes, right? Same principles. It's how they're used. What you're saying is we're being manipulated by the negative use of what are just natural laws.
Yeah, the reality is that we live in a polar universe, and there's the positive and negative. And, even taking 5G, for instance, on one end of the spectrum, if from a millimeter wave, it does horrific damage. On the other spectrum of a millimeter wave, it can be healing. So same principle. But yes, there's differences in the administration, and there's differences in how you turn up the heat, so to speak, on what these things are. But principally, they work on the same principles. How something will go into a cell in order to make a change.
Yes, and that's a good example of something that we have to give our consent to, or should have to give our consent to, and are not being given that opportunity.
Correct.
So let's talk about how the totalitarian tiptoe has tiptoed into our lives.
Yeah, so I recently was sitting with a book that just came out, and it's Matthias Desmet's book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And it's fascinating because what he's talking about is essentially 4 main things to watch out for, and he's studied deeply in these areas. He's a professor in Belgium, and he's been studying this totalitarian tiptoe for his whole career. And what he says is that with generalized loneliness or isolation, that's the first step. So when we're isolated.
Wow, we just had a big spate of that globally.
Then that gives way to a lack of meaning. Because if we're not having connection with each other, then where are we deriving meaning? And if you're cut off from your work or cut off from people that you love and know, or they're making different choices than you, that sets up loneliness.
Well, maybe that's why we started seeing a big surge of people wearing their pajamas to the grocery store in the middle of the day. Who cares?
I didn't see that. That's awesome. Yeah. So, yeah, it probably is that, because really it's a lack of meaning.
Right.
I'm not going to derive meaning from this. And you know, how many people are in jobs where they're not necessarily following their soul's passion? They're doing jobs that are just sort of, I have to do this for money or whatever. But it's a disconnect in there, and that further helps to reduce meaning.